Hello, everybody. It's really great to see you, and thank you very much for joining these sessions. This material is something I prepared for the Southwest Ministerial Training course, but it seemed a really good thing to use at the cathedral because it seems to be a theme which was really important for our living and our discipleship generally. We've called it Magnificat, living the countercultural lifestyle of Christ and the saints. Um, I want to start with Mary because, of course, the Magnificat is Mary's song, and that is the text for this discussion. The Magnificat is used every evening in the Christian church. Christians sing every day, He that is mighty hath magnified me. The church celebrates with Mary and celebrates Mary in our liturgy. There is a danger, though, in some of the church's devotion to Mary. We risk putting her on a pedestal where we can control or manipulate her so that we can continue to promote domineering agendas. Her story has been used to control women, to promote an oppressive ideology around women's sexuality with an ideal of purity or virginity, or to promote an ideal of obedience and acquiescence in women as a counterpoint to male leadership, or to define female vocation as motherhood in a way that denies women other opportunities to answer God's call. Rowan Williams says at one point that the Christian tradition has within itself the capacity for self-criticism and correction. And it seems to me that Mary's song provides us with a good starting point. It is a protest against all forms of oppression. Mary protests when we exploit her in order to oppress women. I'd go further than this and say that her yes to the angel, far from being an act of obedience to male authority, is actually a claim to bodily autonomy. She makes her response directly to the angel. She doesn't consult Joseph first. In other words, her fiancé doesn't get to veto her path in life. With her own voice, she says, "Be it unto me according to thy word." And the virginal conception is a sign that God and Mary will not be limited by biology or her sexual status. On the 15th of August, we keep the feast of the Blessed Virgin Mary. In the Roman Catholic Church, it's the feast of the Assumption. And last year, I was caught by the reading which we had from the holy writers um, on that day, and it came from two modern Roman Catholic theologians, Ivone Gabara and Maria Bingema, who wrote a book, Mary, Mother of God, Mother of the Poor. They talk about the Assumption, which is the Roman Catholic doctrine that Mary was saved from bodily corruption and taken up to heaven at the point of her death. But I think it's got something important to teach us, as they say. Mary's Assumption brings a new and promising future for women, excluded from Jewish initiation rites because of their anatomy, banned from full participation in worship and the synagogue by their menstrual cycle. For a long time, women, even in Christianity, subtly or explicitly have been second-class citizens in the world of faith because of the inferiority and poverty of their bodies. Mary's Assumption, however, restores and reintegrates women's bodiliness into the very mystery of God. Starting with Mary, the dignity of women's condition is recognized and safeguarded by that very bodiliness. They go on to say that the Assumption also speaks of God's preference for those who are poor or small or unprotected. What Mary says in the Magnificat, "He hath exalted the humble and meek, he hath filled the hungry with good things," is displayed to the whole universe in Mary's exaltation to heaven. But this is only the case if we also acknowledge Mary's fellowship with those who are poor or vulnerable. Our tendency has been to differentiate Mary from the mass of humanity, to see in her vocation to be the Mother of God a distinction from all others. It ensures her story of the lowly being exalted doesn't translate into societal or political change. Our fellowship with Mary in the communion of saints is, however, solidarity with the persecuted and oppressed of every age. And her vocation to be God-bearer, the original form of the more edgy phrase Mother of God, is the vocation of each of us who are called to carry God in our lives. And Mary herself declares that her story is a type of God's world-disrupting salvation. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seat. He hath filled the hungry with good things. Henry Martyn, whom the Church of England celebrates as a missionary and translator of the Scriptures, went to India in 1805 as the chaplain to the East India Company. The company assumed he would minister only to the expatriates, but he engaged the local population. He learned their language and taught them the faith. The East India Company didn't want him to share the Magnificat with them. They were worried that Mary's words, "He hath put down the mighty," might lead the locals to ideas of revolution. And they were right, of course. Mary is dangerous to vested interests and oppressive regimes. They will do anything to neuter her story, her influence. But Mary's magnification is the sign that God's vocation and liberating grace win out over attempts at control. Think for a moment of the subversions that Mary mentions. He hath scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He hath put down the mighty from their seat, and hath exalted the humble and meek. He hath filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent empty away. This speaks to arrogance and the misuse of power in government, in the workplace, and in domestic situations. It speaks to issues of poverty and hunger, of abuse, wealth, and choosing lowliness. But it is not a political agenda or programme. In that sense, it begs more questions than it answers. And it makes us somewhat uncomfortable in locating ourselves. But perhaps this discomfort is the starting point for a countercultural lifestyle. We are not merely countering the values and practices of others. We need to live counter to our own first choices. Perhaps a countercultural lifestyle is simply a penitent lifestyle. We'll return to that later. Mary's other present to the Church is the gift of praise and song. Magnificat, sung each evening by the Church, begins with the praise of God. My soul doth magnify the Lord. Modern translations have obscured the ways in which the lines, my soul doth magnify the Lord, and he that is mighty hath magnified me, echo each other. The poor whom God raises up, raise up God in their praises. Song and celebration are an amazing antidote to spirit and body oppressed. St. Paul and Silas in prison in Philippi sang songs to God that shook the foundations of the prison and set the captives free. Spirituals developed among African Americans living with hope of emancipation from the oppression of slavery. And these songs galvanized spirits and claimed the stories of Scripture as support for liberation. Choirs have been created to carry messages of political protest in support of the environment, or of nuclear disarmament, or of refugees. And choral singing has been used to lessen the harmful effects of depression or multiple sclerosis. And listening to song also lifts the spirit and invites us to a place where our senses free us from the weight of our thinking. We lose our sense of the Eucharist or of hymns of praise as dangerous endeavours, as subversive activities at our peril. With Mary, we are at our most faithful when we stand alongside those who are mistreated, forgotten, or discriminated against. With them we sing, He that is mighty hath magnified me. Their liberation is our liberation, is Mary's liberation. We stand before the throne of grace in company with one another and seeking God's glory. So a couple of questions at the end of this first session. How does the story and song of Mary speak to us of a life lived for God? And what movements of liberation do we feel drawn to? Hello again. I made the comment in the first section reflecting on the Magnificat that a countercultural lifestyle may be a penitent lifestyle. And I'd like to use that as a starting point for thinking more specifically about what we mean by countercultural values and how these are the values of the saints. Countercultural is an attractive but also a reactive phrase. It sounds as if our values are a response to the world in which we are set. And certainly St. Paul says, do not be conformed to the present age. But it is clearly arguable that the things of God are not a counter to a prior culture. Rather, the things of God are prior. God creates out of nothing. The initiative is God's. And we are seeking to align ourselves with the deepest and most basic values of being: love, creativity, self-giving, silence, rest, forgiveness, and more. This might be more helpful than simply assuming that countercultural is good. After all, values change. It would have been subversively countercultural to argue for gay rights in 1920, but it's very different in 2020. And we can see similar changes around slavery or women's rights or religious freedom. It would have been countercultural not to be a worshipper in the Church of England in 1600, but by 2020, being a worshipper is arguably countercultural. And we could see similar changes around living together out of wedlock. I could go on, but you get the point. What counts as countercultural is ambiguous, and it may be more or less desirable from a Christian perspective. So I'm going to talk through some areas in which might consider what are the values of Jesus and the saints. I want to say that this list is not exhaustive, and it raises questions rather than simply answering them. But countercultural, or perhaps we say penitent living, might mean something like this. Say in the area of academic inquiry, it might mean nuance instead of oversimplification, creativity rather than simply seeking the right answer, curiosity rather than simply wanting to pass exams. In the life of society, it might mean choosing sustainability over growth, deference to vulnerability rather than deference to results or spending power, or choosing recycling over always resorting to the marketplace. In political life, it might mean choosing discourse over sound bites, or substance over presentation. Or in personal life, it might mean choosing self-correction over correcting others, participation rather than avoidance, making genuine apologies rather than the kind of, oh, I'm sorry that you felt that way kind of apology. Perhaps we could add what it means to live counterculturally or penitently in international relations, in the arts, in sporting life, in business or employment. These would be good talking points. There's a tiny story in The Desert Fathers recounted by Rowan Williams in Silence and Honeycakes that demonstrates what we mean by penitent living. A brother sinned and was turned out of the church by the priest. Abba Bessarion got up and followed him out. He said, I too am a sinner. Just 28 words long, but it contains so much. There's the dominant culture of the church and the priest, which defines sin and stands in judgment. Perhaps it's hard for institutions to take a different line if they need to survive. They need boundaries, authority, and recognized representatives. But Abba Bessarion acted counterculturally. He doesn't argue or disrupt the meeting, but his walking out is equally eloquent. He claims his own faults, even though his claim clearly heaps burning coals upon the heads of others. And he chooses to be on the outside with the outcast and sinner, without any guarantee of success. His action is effective, direct action, but one in which he accepts the consequences of his actions and risks losing face himself in order to be with the outcast brother. In his commentary on St. Mark's Gospel, Binding the Strong Man, Ched Myers argues that the story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman might be interpreted in a similar manner. You remember, she comes and asks for healing for her daughter, and Jesus ignores her and suggests that she is a dog because she's a Gentile. In a culture dominated by a system of honor, Jesus, Ched Myers suggests, chooses shame in order to raise the woman up. He writes, her solicitation is an affront to the honor status of Jesus. No woman, especially a Gentile unknown and unrelated to this Jew, would have dared invade his privacy at home to seek his favor. A rebuff from Jesus is therefore not only understandable but expected. The fact that the woman wishes to argue the point deepens her affront to Jesus. It is she who wishes to demonstrate the rights of her people to the liberating power of Jesus' exorcism ministry. Given the utterly shameful behavior and pagan character of the woman, it is shocking that Jesus concedes her the debate. The woman has left your daughter. Jesus allows himself to become shamed, to become the least, in order to include this pagan woman in the new community of the kingdom. What this and the story of Abba Basarian reveal is that the subversive actions make the subverter themselves vulnerable. There isn't a wholly safe place from which to be countercultural or penitent in the manner of the saints. Perhaps this should be obvious from the story of Jesus himself, who ended up on a cross. Towards the beginning of lockdown, I had reason to reflect on the theme of penitence and vulnerability in public life, given the obvious difficulty that those who hold political positions have in admitting when they get it wrong. What I sought to argue that this is not principally about the abuse of power or clinging to power. It is rather about the inability of our culture to deal well with those who admit their mistakes. Christians say that penitence leads to forgiveness, but the press is not waiting to throw its arms around public figures who say sorry. It's not waiting to welcome them home. It's not even offering to stop blaming and shaming them. In fact, if a public figure says sorry, there's a good chance that they will forever after be called disgraced. In this kind of context, saying sorry is pretty impossible. And we needs to own that the fault is not just with public figures who can't say sorry, but with a public culture that is addicted to apportioning blame and creating scapegoats. And in this context, one countercultural, one penitent mission of the Church is to help society revalue penitence by modelling both penitence and forgiveness well. We could add this to the list of countercultural virtues above: modelling admission of faults, reparation and reintegration, rather than adding to finger pointing, shaming and ostracising those who get it wrong. And such a role, of course, stabilizes society, allowing for a greater degree of human flourishing. And this is important because there is a risk that countercultural values are construed as subversive in a merely destructive way, undoing economic or political norms without offering alternatives that safeguard well-being. But St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in his wonderful work, The City of God, actually shows us the ways in which the countercultural values of the City of God actually contribute to the well-being of society. He contrasts the values of the earthly city with the countercultural values of the city of God. There are two loves, he writes, the first holy, the second foul, the first social, the second selfish. The first consults the common welfare for the sake of a celestial society. The second grasps at selfish control of social affairs for the sake of arrogant domination. First is submissive to God, the second tries to rival God. The first is quiet, the second restless, the first peaceful, the second troublemaking. The first prefers truth to the praises of those who are in error. The second is greedy for praise, however it may be obtained. The first is friendly, the second envious. The first desires for its neighbour what it wishes for itself. The second desires to subjugate its neighbour. The first rules the neighbour for the sake of the good of the neighbour. The second rules for its own advantage. In other words, Christians, by being citizens of heaven and adhering to the heavenly city, actually make better citizens on earth because they guard for the temporal dispensation the values of God. So Christians are subversive, that is, they are subversive of the values of the earthly city. It's in a way that increases rather than decreases stability, justice, and peace. So to sum up, I've sought to explore the idea of countercultural living as penitent living. Within this context, we unpacked some ways in which penitent living might be seen in public and personal living, and particularly explored the relationship between such penitent living and being a citizen in modern society. We might express this as being in the world, but not of the world, to employ an overused cliche. Penitent living requires a nuance in our relationship with society, in which we are neither invested in destructive values, but nor are we dismissive of the possibility of society being a place of human flourishing, and we are ready to contribute to it being so. And so some questions. Can we explore ways in which penitent living can be a reality in different arenas of life? And where do you feel you can make the biggest difference? At the political demonstration, standing with your placard, or in the legislative chamber, arguing and voting for change? Welcome again. In the last section, we talked about countercultural living as penitent living. I want to take a slightly different theme this time and talk about countercultural living as intentional living. That is, living which takes on commitments and seeks to live true to them. And I want first to talk about a rule of life. That is, a statement of those commitments and intentions which we undertake. We finished our last section by looking at St. Augustine. Fast forward a century or so, and we found ourselves in the presence of another great saint of the church, St. Benedict, though he had a very different vocation from Augustine. His legacy to the church and society is nevertheless also profound. Benedict, often known as the father of Western monasticism, founded communities which lived under a rule, which offered hospitality and were motivated by a commitment to conversion of life, that is, to penitence, and also to stability, to learning, to work, and to prayer. This legacy and witness influenced most religious communities for the next 1400 years and has had a huge impact on the wider church. Importantly, Benedictine houses preserved learning and texts in the form of their libraries and the wisdom of a past theological and philosophical tradition through the turmoil of collapse of the Roman Empire and of what we rudely call the Dark Ages. And at the centre of these communities is the Rule of St. Benedict, a short text and an immensely practical one, which regulated the lives of his communities and demonstrates wisdom, generosity, an understanding of the human spirit, pragmatism, and realism like no other. Benedict says in the prologue to the rule, "We propose to establish a school of the Lord's service. In founding this, we hope that we shall not make rules that are harsh or burdensome, but if, for the good of all concerned, for the correction of faults or the preservation of charity, there be some strictness of discipline, do not be immediately daunted and run away from the way that leads to salvation. Its entrance is inevitably narrow, but as we progress in this way of life and of faith, our hearts will be enlarged, and we shall run in the way of God's commandments with an inexpressible delight of love." Perhaps we need intentional living and a rule of life even more on account of the freedoms of the modern world. Many shared assumptions around the way we live, such as careers, relationship patterns, and leisure, have broken down and have given us a range of choices difficult to navigate. So we need help in choosing. Some people even employ life coaches to help them find the path through the many options available to them. Of course, everybody has patterns and habits in their life. Without them, daily living would be a constant trauma of decision making. But a rule of life seeks to ensure that our habits are healthy ones. There are two kinds of rule of life. One for a community, like the rule of St. Benedict, and one for individuals, which each person creates and hones for themselves. But they have in common a sense of accountability to self, to community, perhaps to a spiritual director, and to God. Many of you will be aware of the cathedral's rule of life, which seeks to be a rule for the whole community, but sufficiently general that people can construct their own rule around it. Of course, there are plenty of other contexts outside the church in which people opt for intentional living. One obvious one is amongst those who engage in 12-step recovery programs in order to overcome addictions. Here too, a daily pattern of prayer and reading, accountability to a sponsor, and attendance at meetings with others are a part of the program. It is perfectly possible, of course, for intentional living to be harmful, as when someone sets out to destroy another person's reputation. So one of the factors in intentional living from a Christian perspective is discernment, seeking to know the desire and will of God. I have been much influenced by St. Ignatius of Loyola, one of the most eloquent advocates of countercultural, of penitent and intentional living. His spiritual exercises are a way of inviting people to confront the attachments that draw us into destructive patterns. He mentions four particular categories of attachment in the principle and foundation of his exercises. That is, the wrong attachment to honour, to wealth, to health, and to long life. Ignatius and much of the spiritual tradition use the word indifference to speak about the attitude we have to these things. The word indifference can be misleading to modern ears, as we use the word indifference to mean a callous disregard for rightful concern. But Ignatius doesn't mean this at all. He is not being dismissive of a proper concern for our physical health or our reputation, but he is suggesting that when this concern becomes so dominant that we cannot live with the other possibility, that our love for God becomes eclipsed by obsession for other people's admiration or wanting to avoid illness at all costs, then we are in spiritual danger. The Jesuit author Gerard Hughes, in his book The God of Surprises, takes indifference to mean poise. That is, that perfectly balanced point in which we are not swayed either to the right or to the left by our attachments, but can remain aligned, with the life and desire of God. Another Jesuit priest, Herbert Alfonso, talks about personal vocation. Alfonso suggests that God has a unique calling for each of us. This isn't so much what we're called to do, but who we're called to be. It is, he says, the name that God has given to us. I have called you by name and you are mine, says God in the prophet Isaiah. Our personal vocation will remain with us, says Alfonso, throughout our lives, and will be expressed in different ways in different contexts. One writer I know talks about her personal vocation as care for creation, another as to be brother. Perhaps our personal vocation sounds rather inconsequential to other people, but it is deeply meaningful to us. My working hypothesis for the last 4 years has been that my personal vocation is to be companion. Whenever I've reflected on what gives me joy and hope in life, it is about accompanying others on the journey of faith, on the journey of life. And I'm drawn to those stories in Scripture about people sharing meals and finding fellowship. A companion, of course, literally, is someone who shares bread with another. So in this third section, I've suggested that living in tune with God, with Jesus and with the saints, involves intentional living, which might be expressed in a rule of life, that our rule will be the better if we're free from attachments, so that we can make good commitments and decisions, and that positively, us seeking our vocation will free us from simply being at the mercy of the latest impulse or fashion. So some final questions. What are your addictions or attachments? What words would you use to express your personal vocation? And how does the church encourage us to intentional living? I very much hope to see you at the discussion we will have about all of this on Thursday, the 19th of November at 7 o'clock in the evening on Zoom. Until then, thank you for listening.